Good afternoon. I'm Kitty Marks, Director of the CMS Division of Tribal Affairs, and I welcome you to today's webinar for IHS and tribal hospitals to learn more about the Medicare Disproportionate Share Hospital Uncompensated Care Proposals as outlined in the FY 2021 Inpatient Proposed Rules. The link to the proposed rule is in the Save the Date notice that we sent out announcing the webinar. I am joined on today's webinar with Dr. Susan Carroll with the Division of Tribal Affairs, as well as Don Thompson and Mike Rafferty in the Division of Acute Care in the Hospital and Ambulatory Policy Group in the Center for Medicare. Don and Mike will provide an overview of the FY 2021 proposals specific for IHS tribal hospitals. Today, there will be an opportunity for questions and comments, but for comments to be considered officially, comments must be submitted in writing no later than 5 p.m. Eastern Time on July 10th, 2020, to one of the addresses listed in the Federal Register notice. Again, the link to the Federal Register notice is in the Save the Date notice. Now I would like to introduce Don Thompson, Director of the Division of Acute Care in the Hospital and Ambulatory Group. Don, please go ahead.
Thanks, Kitty. I appreciate everyone being able to get on the call today. We're looking forward to a lot of good feedback, both on the call as well as during the comment period for the inpatient hospital notice of proposed rulemaking that Kitty mentioned. So as a bit of background to this issue, hospitals for years received disproportionate share hospital payments from Medicare, including IHS and tribal hospitals. The Affordable Care Act changed how those payments were structured, and what it essentially did was it split them into two pieces. It said, okay, keep doing the way you used to allocate those payments, which is using essentially low income insured days. Keep paying them that way for 25% of what you were paying before. And then for 75% of them, we want you to pay that amount based on each hospital's uncompensated care burden in a relative sense. So we look at the total uncompensated care burden across all hospitals, and essentially whatever percentage of that burden that a hospital has, that's how much money that hospital receives. And the way we determine the total amount that's available to be allocated to all the different hospitals is by looking what we would have paid for dish payments, sort of under the old system, the pre-ACA system. And then that gets reduced for a couple of factors, one of the primary ones being changes in the uninsured population. So as the uninsured population increases, the amount of dollars for payments for uncompensated care increases, and as the number of uninsured people nationally decreases, then the available funding becomes lower for uncompensated care payments. So when the ACA first passed, and we were looking at different ways to implement this provision in the ACA, one question that came up was what data source would be used to determine uncompensated care payments. Initially, we had been looking towards the worksheet S10 data on the cost reports that hospitals file as a source for how much uncompensated care burden each hospital in the country had. There were some issues raised with respect to sort of the completeness of that data and the fact that that data had not been previously extensively audited. So for the first couple of years, we didn't use the worksheet S10 data. We essentially continued allocating based on the old methodology, the low-income insured days, until we could clarify some of the instructions under the worksheet S10 and get some audits in place for that data. So over the years, we've been doing that, and we have now gotten to the point where for all the hospitals in the country, with the exception of IHS and tribal hospitals and hospitals in Puerto Rico, we are relying on the worksheet S10 data, the uncompensated care burden that's on the hospital's cost reports, in order to allocate that 75% of the money for uncompensated care, allocate that down to the individual hospitals. So old system was sort of 100% low-income insured days. ACA comes along and says, okay, split that essentially 75-25. Continue doing what you were doing for the 25%, the old dish payments based on a low-income insured. Take the remaining portion, adjust it for changes in the uninsured population, and then allocate that down using the hospital's uncompensated care burden. And we get that information now from the S10, with the exception of for IHS and tribal and Puerto Rico hospitals. We are continuing to propose that for the coming fiscal year, so for fiscal, right now we're in fiscal 20, for fiscal 2021, we are continuing to propose the same exception that we have for IHS and tribal hospitals, as well as Puerto Rico. So what we are sort of discussing here is nothing that will impact the coming payments for the coming fiscal year, 2021. We're looking at a year from this fall. We're trying to think through what the most appropriate approach would be for IHS and tribal hospitals, as well as Puerto Rico hospitals, sort of moving forward. One thought we had was to begin to use the worksheet S10 data for IHS and tribal hospitals, as well as for Puerto Rico. But another thought we have, and this is what we discussed in the IPPS inpatient prospective payment system hospital proposed rule, was to say, perhaps when Congress made the change that they made in the Affordable Care Act, the analysis that went on for that, a lot of which was done by the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, wasn't really necessarily focused on IHS and tribal hospitals. And so given that analysis that sort of created this post-ACA world was not necessarily focused on IHS and tribal hospitals, perhaps it would be appropriate, rather than moving to the worksheet S10 data for these hospitals, if we exempted IHS and tribal hospitals beginning in 2022 from the ACA changes and went back to the way the dish payments were paid prior to the ACA. And so what that would mean is the ACA again split the available dollars for uncompensated care into two pieces, 25% of the classic dish, if you will, and then 75% the new system. We would just go back for IHS and tribal hospitals to the way the payments were made prior to the ACA. So all of the, instead of having only 25% based on the old classic dish, it would go back to having 100% of the IHS and tribal hospitals under the old dish methodology, under the old dish payments. And that was what we were trying to get feedback on, or any other approaches that might be appropriate for IHS and tribal hospitals, given the unique nature of those hospitals. So that's really what we were looking for in terms of feedback. So any thoughts really on sort of the way the payments are working now, the way we might want to change those payments for the future, and if we do want to change those payments for the future, what is the best way to accomplish that? And one idea would be, again, to sort of go back to the way the world looked before the ACA for the IHS and tribal hospitals, but we're certainly open to other suggestions and comments about what would be appropriate in this context. So with that, I think I'll open up. People may have questions. This is a very complicated part of the Medicare payment world. These payments are neither straightforward or easily explained. It's a very complicated statutory formula, both for the old payments as well as for the new payments post ACA. So any questions people have either about the way the system is currently constructed or our proposal, feel free. I want to have a very wide open, wide-ranging discussion here. So don't hesitate to ask any questions on any aspects of the of either the proposal or the current system, and we'll try to answer those. So with that, I think I'll turn it over and maybe open up the lines and ask for questions.
All right, so as a reminder, to ask a question, you will need to press star 1 on your telephone. To withdraw your question, press the pound key. Again, that is star 1 on your telephone. Please stand by while we compile the Q&A roster. We have no question on the queue. You may continue.
I guess we were hoping that was sort of the presentation. We were hoping to get some feedback, but if folks aren't prepared right now to provide feedback, obviously that's fine. We want to continue this dialogue, and the proposed rule is not the only mechanism. Certainly would encourage everyone to comment on the proposed rule, and if you have questions after this, would certainly want you to reach out and provide those to us so that we can further the discussion. And as I said, this is also for fiscal 2022, so there'll be additional opportunities for us to consult with the tribes and IHS as this evolves. But
hey, John, this is. I don't know if you can address this, but do you see any downsides or implications if, as what was proposed in the IPPS rules, that the payment would be determined at 100% of the calculated amount? I mean, that's much better than the 20%, 25% is required under the Affordable Care Act.
Right. So I think one way to get a sense of that for the individual hospitals. So right now, you're essentially getting dish payments. Let's call those classic dish, for lack of a better word. So you're getting classic dish payments now, if you are, and you could essentially, if you wanted to sort of gauge what your payments would be like if we used. If we went and went back to the pre-ACA system, you could essentially multiply those payments by 3. So the classic dish is now only 25% of what it was before. But if we were to go to the pre-ACA provision, you could take the payments you're currently getting, multiply those by 3, and that would be the additional amount that you would be receiving if we went back to the old system. But what you'd be losing is any uncompensated care payments that you're currently getting. So each individual hospital, to get a sense of how this idea that we're seeking feedback on would work, you can look at your own hospital finances in terms of your Medicare payments, and you will be able to tell what the difference is between the current payments that you're getting, which are a combination of the current dish payments plus the uncompensated care payments, and then if you think of your current dish payments, if you think of sort of multiplying those by 3 to represent the remaining 75% you would get, add that to your current dish payments that you would get, and you could compare that to the current combination of your dish payments and your uncompensated care payments. And that would give you the impact. In general, most hospitals, at least based on the historical data that we have, would see declines under that approach. Those declines are not as large as what would happen if we went to the worksheet S10 data. There isn't a lot of uncompensated care for IHS hospitals reported on the worksheet S10. So this would provide, the approach we're discussing would provide more funding than if we treated IHS and tribal hospitals similar to non-IHS and tribal hospitals. But it is still relatively redistributional, and I expect when if an individual hospital will look at that calculation, the majority of hospitals will actually see payment declines under what we're discussing in the proposed rule for 2022. There are a few hospitals that will see payment increases. On net, the total payments to the IHS and the tribal hospitals are actually, it's about a wash, pretty close to a wash, to what they're currently getting in aggregate, but it is extremely redistributional. So it would take, again, most hospitals would see declines, and then a few hospitals would see payment increases under what we have discussed. But again, certainly what we've discussed is much more funding than would occur, uncompensated care payments that would occur compared to an alternative of using the worksheet S10, if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful. Operator, can you check? Are there any questions in the queue?
Yep, again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1. We do have a question on the queue. Please state your first and last name. You are now live.
Yeah, I don't know if it's me. I didn't hear a prompt, but can you hear me? Is it me that's in the queue or up?
Yeah, Jim, this is Kitty. Could you identify yourself, please?
Sure. Yeah, Jim Roberts with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and I want to thank the gentlemen that are on the call for doing this. I was a little concerned that we didn't have any questions, so I kind of feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose, trying to catch up to how this process works and such, not being intimately familiar. So I do appreciate the kind of the high level overview. But I want to come back to the points that were raised about, potentially going back to the old formula where 100% of the cost would be based, or 100% of the process, maybe for lack of a better term, would be paid under the old payment methodology. When the available funding is that also separated into the same percentile pools of funding? So those entities that would be paid under the using the old process that's described in the rule, would they just be accessing the 25% of the funding if that was the case, or is all the funding treated in aggregate? I'm sure there was a better way to ask that question, but hopefully you understood what I meant.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think that's one of the things we'd be looking for feedback on about how that would be structured. So I believe your facility is one of the ones that would see an increase under if we went to the pre-ACA world. And so I think one of the things that we're looking for feedback on is your question, which is that what would happen? Is it sort of a pool of dollars that would be reallocated among the IHS and tribal hospitals? Or would it literally just be the payments that would go to those hospitals? I think that's something that we're very interested in feedback on. As it's sort of discussed in the proposed rule, if we literally just went back to the pre-ACA world, there is no fund that is created to be reallocated. It would literally be each hospital's dish payments as they would have occurred pre-ACA, but there are certainly variations of that that could be explored, depending on what our statutory authority is, about how those payments might be allocated among the IHS and the tribal hospitals, if that's helpful. So I guess I would say it as, nothing's off the table here at this point, because, we are doing this with such a much bigger lead time. Normally we would propose something and it would be effective for the next fiscal year. Given the nature of this issue, we wanted to make sure we had as much time as possible to discuss it with all the tribal hospitals and the IHS hospitals. So we have some lead time here, so that's certainly a question that you could raise in the comment period and others could raise about whether it would be optimally structured as, to the extent people supported this or wanted to comment on it, whether it would be optimally structured as each hospital gets what it would have gotten pre-ACA, or whether it would be structured differently, more along the lines of the uncompensated care pool, which then gets allocated to hospitals based on our criteria. Did I answer your question? I understand correctly?
No, it did. So, and your response kind of prompts some additional questions from me, and I hope I'm not going to take too much of folks' time because I do have one other question I wanted to get back to. But in response to what you just explained, how many of it sounds like you guys have done kind of the cost-benefit analysis associated with those tribal hospitals that would have submitted cost reports. Out of the universe of tribal reports, how many, maybe on a percentile basis, would have benefited similar to ANTHC as you explained?
So I think it's difficult because we don't necessarily have the data on which we would be making the 2022 payments yet. So the only thing we do is sort of look at the historical data. So it's hard to say precisely what it would look like for 2022. But Michael should correct me, but I believe in what we've modeled, I think there are only 2 hospitals that would see an increase. And I think yours is by far the hospital that would see the largest increase. I think the other one is relatively small. And so when I talk about the redistributions, it's redistributing essentially from all the IHS and tribal hospitals that are currently getting DISH and UCP payments, and those would be reduced. And then I think your hospital and one other would see increases. But again, that's just based on the model data that we have from the historic. So that's not to say that's what the world would look like in 2022. But I'm going to pause for a second and ask Michael if I have that correct on the redistributions. He might be on mute. But you could roughly, it's a small number.
Well, that's certainly helpful to kind of understand the impact of the change. Now, I want to come back. You guys held a call about 6 months ago, maybe, I don't know what the time frame was precisely, but kind of probing for additional types of costs that aren't included on S10 or ways to kind of how the data might be changed. Did you guys get any ideas of things that would be recommended that could be integrated into the process that could potentially increase the way uncompensated care and charity care are measured on the S10?
So that's been a challenge for us. We are going out in a parallel but separate process from the inpatient proposed rule. There will be an opportunity to comment on the worksheet S10 itself. That hopefully that process will open up in the coming weeks, and we can certainly share that with the group, with the IHS and the tribal hospitals when that's open for comment, and certainly would be welcome to input on this issue as well. It's been frankly challenging for us to figure out, given sort of some of the principles that underlie the uncompensated care payments, it's been sort of challenging for us and continues to be challenging for us to determine how to define those differently in a way that might mitigate the payment impact on IHS and tribal hospitals. So the issue is, is surrounding sort of, are there ways to change the definition that sort of makes sense from a policy standpoint, and wouldn't sort of have very broad implications for all the hospitals in the country. It's as you can imagine, the uncompensated care pool, I think, is around $8 billion, give or take, that gets distributed across the whole country. And over the years since the ACA has passed, there's been a great deal of work, as I mentioned, to clarify instructions, audit, and do rulemaking to really clarify what is uncompensated care. And I wouldn't presume that there is a uniformity of acceptance or happiness across all the hospitals as to what constitutes uncompensated care, but we have sort of certain principles that we've laid down in the development of the definition. And I think one of the challenges has been, and one of those, as an example, maybe to make it more concrete, one of those principles is that there is a difference between uncompensated care and what many hospitals would say is undercompensated care. So, for example, many hospitals would like us to treat Medicaid payments as sort of definitionally uncompensated care, as an extreme example. So they would say that these hospitals have alleged that the Medicaid payment rates are inadequate, and therefore the differential, if you will, between the Medicaid payments and what their costs are by definition uncompensated care. We have not accepted that in principle, that the payment, for example, the Medicaid payment is payment in full for the service, and that differential gap is not considered to be uncompensated care. And so,
if I understand right, then it seems that in part some of these are the statutory definitional references that are included, kind of like in the instructions of the S10. So in there you would describe kind of some of the limitations or regulatory requirements with either like the Balanced Budget Refinement Act, the ACA, et cetera. So I think, as I understand it, in part it's statute, but in part it's also principles that you have adopted as you apply those, the implementation of the law.
Correct. And so the question sort of in the context of, say, for example, IHS and tribal hospitals is sort of if we were to attempt to alter the definition of uncompensated care with respect to IHS and tribal hospitals, what implications that might have more broadly with respect to the general uncompensated care payments. And that's been a challenge for us. But we continue, we're always open to suggestions and ideas, and you could make those suggestions both on the inpatient prospective payment system proposed rule as part of these tribal consultations, or as part of comments on the worksheet S10. Those would be three different avenues. You can take advantage of all three. Certainly commenting officially on the rule is a key source of input for us, but not the only one. But yeah, that's been a challenge for us, and you are correct. It's been a challenge preceding the call that we had last time, and in the interim through this particular call about what constitutes uncompensated care for more broadly and for IHS and tribal hospitals specifically.
Yeah. So two last points, and then I'll just put myself on mute and let you respond, and then Kitty, you guys can go on to other folks because I know I've taken a great deal of time. One with respect to hospitals' charity care policy. So it seems like at least what's allowed in part in the S10 are somewhat linked to what's allowable under hospital charity care policies. Are there any guidelines on what a policy may or may not include? Hospital develops that, or I guess in other words, are some hospital policies more permissive to capture allowable costs than perhaps other hospitals. Therefore, there might be a disparity in how these costs are measured across the different cost reports by all the hospitals. And then finally, the last point was, I know that the Part B payments for Medicare that the ITU is not allowed to collect was recommended as a measure of uncompensated care. Did you guys ever decide how that could be treated? So finally, I'll just stop there. And I appreciate you guys being on the call. Thank you for doing this.
Sure. So on the first point, certainly there are differences in hospitals' charity care policies. For example, a hospital may not even have a child, and that's an extreme example. If a hospital didn't have a charity care policy, then there would be nothing for them to report as charity care to Medicare on the worksheet S10. So certainly hospitals' decisions with respect to their charity care policies influence what is reportable on the worksheet S10. So that is true. How you design your policy, any hospital. This isn't specific to IHS and tribal hospitals. How any hospital designs its charity care policy can influence the amount that's reportable on the worksheet S10. On the second point, I think one of the challenges for us, and we would love to have some additional feedback, is to what extent does the prohibition on the collection of deductibles in coinsurance, to what extent does that reflect that those deductibles in coinsurance are considered paid for as part of the payments to the hospitals, and to what extent those uncollected deductibles in coinsurance are sort of designed to be a loss for the hospital and sort of are by definition uncompensated care for the hospital. And I think that's been a challenge for us to sort of work through. I don't think there's been a final decision on that one way or the other. I think one of the ideas behind the tribal consultations, as well as the rulemaking, as well as the comments on the worksheet S10, are to sort of elicit additional public feedback on all of these issues. And I think certainly to the extent hospitals want to provide comments on that, we'd certainly welcome it. But it has been, again, challenging in sort of that broader context of, analogously like to undercompensated care versus uncompensated care. To what extent is that prohibition sort of a standalone, if you will, meaning that, again, it's sort of definitionally hospitals can't collect that, and therefore, by definition, that is uncompensated care, and to what extent that provision exists within a context of you can't collect that because the payments that you are receiving are essentially designed to cover that, and that's essentially the issue. And any feedback on that would be welcome.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Don. Operator, can you check if there's others in the queue?
Yep. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1. We do have a question on the queue. Please state your first and last name. You are now live. Again, you are now live.
Hi, this is Kitty Marks. Is there someone on the line? I don't know if you're on mute or we can't hear you.
Hi, this is Rahul Ortiz from the Indian Health Service. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Rahul. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks. Good question. And I think, Don, you had mentioned that IHS did an analysis of the impact to the reimbursements, and we can support what you've said, Don, that it looks like out of all the hospitals that we looked at, that just about every single one would be seeing a decrease from the total dish and uncompensated care payment from this year. The ranges are pretty significant. Some would see just a small amount, but others would see, I think, over $1 million to $1.3 million change, totaling. And if we exclude the hospitals over 100 beds, that would total about $7.5 million decrease. Looking at the two hospitals with over 100 beds, it looks like one of them would get about a $6.8 million increase, and the other one would get about a $44,000 increase. So if you could, I just wanted to ask you to explain the difference in about the cap and why we might see that such a big difference in those hospitals under 100 beds versus the hospitals of over 100 beds. Thanks.
Sure. So under the pre-ACA world, so the payments that your hospitals were receiving prior to the ACA, which under what we've discussed in the rule, we would revert back to. So you would be getting sort of the basis for the payments that you used to get as if the ACA had never existed. So in the statute, not just IHS and tribal hospitals, but in the statute, the way those dish payments, disproportionate share hospital payments were originally developed was even modified over time. But there was an analysis that was done, essentially attempting to quantify, model and quantify to what extent hospitals had additional costs from treating low-income insured patients. So you could think of it as a big, complicated statistical model regression that tried to figure out what factors were significant and drive sort of a differential, significant differential, statistically significant differential payment. What factors that hospitals possess, characteristics of hospitals where there was a gap there where the data would indicate that it costs additional amounts to treat low-income insured patients. And as a result of that regression, it appeared that hospitals that are under 100 beds sort of don't have the same level of the differential, if you will, the additional costs treating low-income insured patients that other hospitals did. So in the law, the way the law is laid out for the dish payments, the pre-ACA dish payments, there's a cap at 12% for hospitals that are under 100 beds because empirically, at the time that analysis was done, those hospitals did not have those additional costs sort of beyond the 12% that could be empirically justified. So I think what's being referenced here is that many IHS hospitals have under 100 beds, and therefore, according to what came out of that model when it was originally developed and then was enshrined in statute, that the dish payments for those hospitals cannot exceed 12%. Does that help?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
So I think one argument, if one challenge anyway, one in the statute explicitly has that in it, and two, it would be hard to at least empirically at this stage to sort of figure out why hospitals under 100 beds should be higher than 12%. That's sort of one of the challenges. So obviously, hospitals that are 100 beds have, not just IHS and tribal hospitals, have in the past attempted to approach Congress about removing that prohibition. but it's, again, because it's at least quasi-empirically based originally when the policies were developed, there would have to be, again, historically, I'm not referring to IHS and tribal hospitals specifically, but, in general, some sort of empirical analysis that would show that those costs are statistically significant compared to other hospitals. And I'm not aware of any analyses that show that. But again, generally, none of these analyses really have, to my knowledge, were ever sort of focused on IHS and tribal hospitals. But as a general statement, that's that cap is in the statute, and that's sort of how it came about.
Thanks for that.
Incredibly wonky issue. Sorry, as I mentioned, the dishes lends itself to the revenge of the mathematicians and the statisticians. It's a very technically wonky issue. I'm always happy I have folks like Michael to keep me straight. But there's a lot of moving parts to it, and a lot of complexity in the statute to it as well.
Okay, thank you, Don and Raho. Operator, could you see if others are in the queue?
Yep, we do have another question on the queue. Please state your first and last name before asking. You are now live.
Hi, this is Kitty Marks again. We can't hear you. If you're on mute, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star one. I guess there are no further questions on the queue. You may continue.
Okay, thank you. Don or Michael, I don't know if you have anything else to add based on comments made so far on the call.
No, I appreciate it, and I certainly understand this is a lot to digest. So certainly this is, as I mentioned, I just want to emphasize this is not the only opportunity here. So, looking forward to, as you said, I think at the end of the last call, continuing this conversation, continuing the dialogue as we try to figure out what the most appropriate policy is for fiscal 2022. So that's all we had.
Okay. And operator, let us know if there's anyone else in the queue. But I would like to remind everybody that comments to the proposed rule is due on July 10th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. There is a link in the Save the Date notice. If you don't have the link, certainly contact our mailbox, tribalaffairs@cms.hhs.gov, and we can send you the link. And then it sounds like there will be another opportunity for perhaps additional tribal comments regarding the S10 worksheet. And when that becomes available for public comment, our office can organize another webinar, tribal input, and again, there'll be an opportunity to provide written comments to that document. So, operator, let me check one more time to see if there's anyone else in the queue.
Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star one. And we still don't have any question on the queue.
Okay, well, very good. Don and Michael and Dr. Carroll, I thank you all for being on today's call. A lot of good information, and it was getting a little bit wonkish even for me. So appreciate all the time that you spent, not only on today's call, but working through these complex issues, and appreciate your opportunity to work through the tribal issues to see how we can maintain these payments to the IHS and tribal system. And thanks to all who participated on today's call. We appreciate you listening. We appreciate the comments and questions asked. And so we'll go ahead and close out today's call. We thank you very much, and everyone have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect. Presenters, you're now back in the Speakers Hub conference.
So, anybody still on?
Yeah, Dr. Carroll's on.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't tell if we're just not getting. I'm not sure we're ever going to get feedback. Like, it's a hard issue to sort of for them. I mean, I understand because it is so wonky. I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like some of it is like we need this money, we can't lose this money, but they don't know how to figure out how to tell us sort of from a technical standpoint what it is. What like path does it go down? I don't blame them for that. Like, I'm sure if I were them, I would know what to do up there. But I don't know, sort of. I don't know. I mean, the IHS obviously, I think, has at least the HHS staff. That they are even they're struggling a bit. I think, again, understandably, but it's just hard to figure out a path forward.
Did you see the Excel spreadsheet that Raho forwarded to us before the call the other day? Yeah.
So, I mean, I get where he's going with the Fed cap. That's, I'm not saying that's impossible. Some of that is dependent on OGC. So, as far as we're concerned, if we wanted to squint and say IHS and tribal hospitals are unique and special, which we've certainly said before in a variety of contexts and we have language for, therefore they're not subject to the cap. Like, I think I personally have no policy objection to that. But the question is whether what OGC would require us to say to justify that. And I think where it gets tricky is what I said on the call, just now, is that the line will be long about why they also are like IHS in that they weren't, quote, the analysis that did this wasn't focused on them and Congress really didn't mean them. And so, just like you did for IHS, you should make an exception for us. Now, I think, again, we have lots of policies that are special and have exceptions for, for IHS hospitals. Some of those are grandfathering, which is a little different because this isn't grandfathering, it's actually carve out. But nevertheless, we do have and have created policies specifically for IHS and tribal hospitals. So, if OGC signs off on it, and OMB signs off, it's additional money is the problem. It's more money. Anything we do here is more money because we can't, on the UCP side, it's all budget neutral, but we can't take the money out of the uncompensated care pool and move it into these dish payments. So anything we're doing here is a cost. And in the context of waiving the bed limit, they'll end up getting more money than they would have combined under the current dish and UCP payments is the problem. So right now, if we just did the pre-ACA, again, in aggregate from an OMB perspective, the money stays about a wash. So that's an easy argument to OMB, right? But under this approach, now you're pumping more money in there, and if there were concerns that the original amount maybe wasn't entirely empirically justified, then having a policy that pumps additional money in might be challenging to defend internally. But again, that sort of is dependent on, which is why I was trying to lead IHS towards getting some departmental support, because some of that is, some of those are political decisions. And, if an order came down that that's the way we're going to do it, then that helps, with the clearance.
Yep.
But in the absence of that sort of leadership interest, in and of itself, just trying to argue it from a staff level, it's not an easy argument to make.
Yep. No, I understand that totally. And I was just wondering, if seeing that chart that Raho produced, if that chart goes out and the different hospitals, tribal and IHS, see that the majority of them are going to take a little bit of a hit, and that's just it. It's some have real hits and others have sort of hits, and it's very difficult sometimes to get them to generate enough interest to want to fight the fight for whatever number your hospital is potentially up for losing.
Right.
So it's part of I think the IHS culture where here they're given allocated funds. Every year you get X number of dollars based on your user population, and you use it and make do with it. And as more and more of the hospitals are working with Medicare, Medicaid, third-party insurances, there's sort of a newer interest, I think, from having worked at IHS for many years, to pay attention to that and to fight for those dollars more aggressively. So that being said, if Raho takes that spreadsheet and pushes it out to the different business office coordinators, will there be more interest? And there may be. It may be that as they sit back, look at the rule, think about it, look at their number, you might see additional comments. I think a lot of people don't comment because they're not quite sure of what it all means. And
right.
I think we'll see with our next call with Raho next week, what response he might be seeing or hearing about. So it may be just the cultural, all right, we'll take the hit and, we're busy, we don't have time to really analyze it and move on. Or maybe there'll be a few more noisy folks, probably on the tribal side, that do fight for every penny. So,
if I were them, I would too.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it makes a difference. It does ultimately. So, all right. Well, Kitty's, I don't think, on the call here, and we'll see what kind of comments we get at the next call. And really appreciate you having these calls, taking the time to explain it, and hopefully we'll get more commentary as the comment period comes to a close.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Take care.
Well, thanks. Yep. Bye-bye.